Greetings, YouTube. So let's be clear. A clone is a copy of another organism. The most readily available examples of that are going to be twins and triplets, identical twins and triplets. They're not perfectly identical. That term is somewhat erroneous, but they're very close to each other. There are differences, but often to the naked eye you can't see them. They look much the same as their brother or sister does. And of course, then you have clones in the term like Star Wars. It was one vast army, all based off of Jango Fett. I think it was Jango Fett, right? Jango Fett was the guy who was based off. I think so, because he was supposed to be some example of martial perfection or something. I don't know, but and they all kind of just ignored the fact that they are all slaves. Technically, we probably call them janissaries. But that's what they were. They were slaves. They were born and raised in an environment where they had no options, where they were just cannon fodder to be thrown at an enemy whenever the fascist empire decided to throw them at an enemy. But they had no rights. But sometimes you see clones in science fiction, whether it's more space opera or cyberpunk, and there's more of a gray zone. Well, I've been reading Beneath the Beanstalk, Under the Beanstalk, which is a cyberpunk setting that is built around the Beanstalk, which is in Ecuador, the former nation of Ecuador, and the city around it is now called New Angeles, and it's 500 million people crammed into this one city, and it's a really rich, deep setting. I feel like they did an excellent job. Almost all of it is system neutral. You could use it for any cyberpunk system you wanted to. And many of these chapters that I'm reading have like maybe one stat block. So using it for other systems would be very easy. It's for the Genesis system, which is more too narrative for my taste. But they have two types of people in the game: bioroids and clones. Now, the bioroids are just androids. They're completely mechanical. They look like us, okay? Probably just to keep the uncanny valley from driving people crazy. But they're just robots, okay? And some of them are trying to like evolve through minds of their own. They're trying to become individuals in their own right, and maybe there's potential that there are some out there who are some of these AIs are true AIs, true artificial intelligence that have evolved beyond their original coding. But the rest of them are called clones. Now, at first, I was a little confused. Like, why would you have clones? Because clones, I mean, if you could clone me, it would be smart. But if you clone me, it would just be a baby that would eventually grow up to look very similar to me. It wouldn't be identical because the world is different now than it was when I was a kid, in types of food and environment and things. The kid would end up not being perfectly identical to me. But again, we'd look related. No, when they are talking about clones in this setting, they're talking about lines of genetically engineered humans that are tailored to specific careers. And they call them clones because they really don't want to call them what they are: slaves. Because they are people. Absolutely 100% people that have been raised to do nothing but what they're told and are treated like disposable things. And that's a more difficult process to pass off as acceptable in a society. But if you call them clones, you make them sound like they're knockoffs. They're not the real thing. It's easier for the society at large to just ignore the fact that those people over there, have got serial numbers tattooed on them, and they're just treated like machines. It's easier to ignore that. And of course, in the game setting, they're using the bioroids and the clones to represent like the next wave of immigrants. So the anti-clone and anti-bioroid sentiments, which are rife in the setting, there's open, naked bigotry towards these two groups of people. And I'm willing to call them bioroids people because enough of them seem to actually be on that path. to me, it just reminds me too much of real world immigrant waves. That like groups of immigrants that have come to a place and then treated like garbage by the people that are already there, even though those people could very well have been immigrants 40 years ago, or were the third wave after the ones that came before them 60 years before and 40 years before that. And it's successive generations and separate waves of immigration. And as soon as one immigrant wave becomes established, they then go about hating the next immigrant wave. You see that in America all the time. There was a time when people hated the fact that there were Irish and Italians and Polish people coming here, and a time when they really weren't considered to be Caucasian. Caucasian, white people, that was like, good English Germanic types. If you weren't one of those folks, then by gosh and by golly, you weren't a real white person. Of course, now they're all considered white people because it's convenient for the white uh, power structure to have them be considered to be white people. But that, to me, within the setting, it just smacks too much of real-world history. And what bugs me in the setting, as much as it bugged me in a real world, is that the poor in this cyberpunk setting have more in common with the bioroids and the clones than they do with the people who are creating the bioroids and clones so they can be exploited. No one is giving, those people aren't stealing your jobs any more than Mexicans are coming here and stealing your job. No. A business owner is taking in a class of worker that they can more easily exploit because they can't exploit you that easily. So don't be mad at the people who are coming here looking for a new life. Don't be mad at the bioroids. Don't be mad at the clones. Be mad at the folks at the top. But if everyone along, the same socioeconomic strata were to like join forces, they would terrify the hell out of the power structure. So to prevent that, they want to have people fighting each other. So the bioroids and the clones are cast as the bad guys. They're the evil folks. So all of the human, because remember, those clones are human. All of the real humans hate them, or many of them do. Uh, One thing that this really would be useful, you could run this with, would be gene funk, because gene funk has some whole lines of genetically engineered strains of humans. Cyberspace did that as well. You could also borrow stuff from Space Master. GURPS did it well. You could have biotech, cyberpunk, and even throw in some ultratech, because there are a handful of energy weapons, because there was some space combat at one point in a war between Luna and Mars and Earth. So any of those systems would be a really good choice for this particular setting I'm talking about. If you don't want to use a Genesis system, and I can see why you don't want to, because again, I don't like that narrative structure myself. But I personally would probably use the gene funk, because the way they handled the different lines of humans that were engineered was very well done. I was really impressed with that. But I couldn't run it the way they're running it. I couldn't have them be as prejudiced against those clones, because they're not clones. They're humans. They're just genetically engineered to have a specific series of traits that really would optimize their career path if they went down certain jobs. It would make sense if a person who is genetically engineered to be a miner to do things that is a mining or mining related, because that's what you've been genetically engineered to do well. But you're not stuck doing it. You are a thinking, feeling being, and you should be treated like a person and have rights. And some people might say, well, it's wrong that you would genetically engineer someone with that predisposition. Well, all of us were born into this world without our consent. None of us agreed to be here. So the same goes with those genetic engineered folks, and they probably have, and then many of them have a far fewer problems than we do, because they've had a lot of those problems filtered out in the process of creating a specific person that's designed for combat, or designed for mining, or designed for being a thinker of some variety, like very intelligent. You know the idea. So I don't see them as any different than us. It's just that some people in our world are born with an incredible ability to swim, like Michael Phelps. He didn't become a great swimmer because he wanted to be one. He was born into the world with physical characteristics that let him become a great swimmer. He was born with those traits, and he was just privileged enough to be in a situation where he was able to take advantage of that. Someone else in the world who had the exact same physical traits as him, but were born, in a favela in Brazil, is never going to become an Olympic athlete. But Michael Phelps did. So it wasn't that he trained to become a world-class swimmer. He was born with the characteristics that let him become a world-class swimmer. And genetic lines of people are the same thing. You've been born into the world with certain characteristics that predispose you to certain career paths that would be optimized for you. But you're not stuck with them. You don't have to be those things. You have a choice. So I really think that I would love to see the whole clone concept of pitting one group of genetically engineered people against the pure strain humans just go by the wayside. It just runs too close to the prejudice I see in the world at large. And I gotta tell you, I don't want that in the games anymore. I don't. It just wears me down just reading about it. It just depresses me. The world is depressing enough. I don't need that reflected in games. Even if you're going to have like a grim and gritty cyberpunk setting, you can still have the man against, it's us against the man. It's, eking out an existence in among gang warfare and things. There's lots of storylines you can do at cyberpunk that don't entail you being a prejudiced jerk. Okay, you don't have to do that. You could be, an open-minded individual and treat everyone with absolute and utter equal rights and civil liberties and still want to gun them down the streets because they stole your car. There's, you can find justifications for that kind of thing in a cyberpunk setting. But you don't need to be a bigot at the same time. And I'm tired of people baking bigotry into settings. I really am. I'm sick of it. And I'm also sick of him hiding behind labels. Don't call them clones. Call them what they are, slaves. It's what you've created. But if you did that, you might get a whole lot of people in the non-slave class to fight against that. It's a lot easier to call them clones and hope that no one else notices. So how many of you folks have noticed the same kind of characteristics in games where they're, obscuring what they really are with, generic, soft, gray kind of terms so that people don't think about the fact that they should be aligning themselves with the oppressed class, because the oppressed class and them have a whole lot more in common than the folks who aren't the oppressed class have in common with the billionaires.